What happens when someone robs a blind man on the most dangerous gangster's territory in all of New York City? And that gangster decides the punishment should fit the crime in a way the robber will remember every single morning for the rest of his life. Harlem, New York. It was a Friday, the 6th of October, 1961, approximately 22 minutes past 11 at night. The back alley behind the Apollo Theater on West 125th Street smelled of garbage, stale beer, and the faint sweetness of someone's discarded cigar. A single bulb above the service door cast a weak yellow circle on the wet asphalt. Not enough light to see clearly, not enough darkness to disappear completely. Somewhere inside, 1,500 people were still on their feet, applauding, screaming, crying, because for the past 90 minutes they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment and became something closer to a religious experience. Ray Charles Robinson, 31 years old, born in Albany, Georgia, blind since the age of 6, genius since the age of always, had just finished his second sold-out show. The heavy metal door swung open. The sound of applause rushed out like a wave, and then died as the door slammed shut behind the man who stepped into the alley. He was alone. His white shirt was soaked through with sweat, clinging to his thin frame. His charcoal gray suit, custom-tailored in Los Angeles, worth more than most people in Harlem earned in 3 months, hung open, the jacket unbuttoned. On his left wrist, a Breitling Navy Timer watch with a knurled bezel that he could read by touch, a gift from his wife Della. On his cuffs, gold cufflinks, a gift from Quincy Jones, who had told him, "Brother, if you're going to play for Kings, dress like one." In his right hand, a brown leather briefcase with brass latches and the monogram RCR. Inside that briefcase, 2 envelopes, $12,000 cash. $4,000 from tonight's 2 shows, $8,000 from 3 previous concerts that they hadn't had time to deposit. Ray Charles tapped his cane on the asphalt. 3 taps, 4, 5. The sound bounced off the brick walls of the alley, painting a picture that only he could see. Walls on both sides, about 8 feet apart, the open street maybe 30 steps ahead, the faint rumble of a car engine somewhere to the left. His assistant, Jeff Brown, had gone to bring the car around. 2 minutes, he'd said, maybe 3. Ray stood still, listened. The night sounds of Harlem filtered in. A woman's laugh from somewhere down the block, the distant pulse of a jukebox playing something that wasn't his, the hiss of tires on wet pavement. He smiled. The kind of tired, satisfied smile of a man who had just poured everything he had into 18 ivories and a microphone and left nothing behind. He did not hear the breathing behind him. 5 seconds. For 5 full seconds, another human being stood less than 4 feet behind Ray Charles and breathed, watched, calculated, saw a blind man with a briefcase in a dark alley, and made a decision. The hands came from behind. The briefcase was ripped from Ray's left hand with such force that his shoulder twisted and his body slammed sideways into the brick wall. The impact sent a shock of pain through his arm. Before he could cry out, before he could raise his hands, those fingers worth more than everything in that briefcase combined, the fingers that had just made 1,500 people forget their poverty and their rage and their fear for 90 minutes. Before he could do anything, a second pair of hands grabbed the lapels of his custom suit and tore into his inside pocket. The envelope with $4,000 disappeared. Then the hands went for his wrist. The Breitling, Della's gift, was yanked off with a twist that scraped skin. Then the cufflinks. The right one came free, but the left one caught on the fabric, and the attacker simply ripped it away, tearing the French cuff along with it. Then a palm, open, hard, deliberate, struck Ray Charles across the face. Not a punch, a slap. The kind of blow designed not to injure, but to humiliate. The dark glasses, the Ray-Ban wayfarers that were as much a part of his face as his nose, flew off and hit the pavement with a sound that Ray would remember for the rest of his life. A small, almost musical sound. The crack of glass, the tinkle of metal. Then footsteps, fast, nervous, the footsteps of a man running, shoes slapping wet asphalt, getting farther, fainter, gone. Silence. Ray Charles was on his knees. His palms were flat on the wet asphalt. The skin scraped raw, bleeding. Without his glasses, his face looked naked. Closed eyelids that the world rarely saw, vulnerable, exposed. His fingers, bleeding, trembling, searched the ground around him, searching for his glasses, for his cane, for anything familiar in the darkness that was always there, that had always been there since he was 6 years old, but that had never felt this hostile, this cruel, this suffocating. He found a piece of the glasses, one lens, cracked in half. He held it in his bleeding fingers like a broken promise. Jeff Brown found him 3 minutes later. The car was at the curb, engine running. Jeff saw the empty alley, the open service door, and then Ray on his knees in the dirt, holding a broken lens. The briefcase gone, the watch gone, the cufflinks gone, the envelope gone. "Ray, what happened, Ray?" Ray Charles did not stand up immediately. He stayed on his knees for 4 more seconds, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, not shaking, not crying, quiet in a way that was worse than screaming. "He hit me in the face, Jeff. He hit a blind man in the face." Jeff helped him up. Ray's hands were shaking now, not from fear, not from cold, but from something that had no name. His right hand kept opening and closing, as if trying to hold something that wasn't there. $12,000. The Breitling, Della gave me that watch. The cufflinks from Quincy. But you know what's worse, Jeff? He knew I was blind. He chose me because I was blind. I heard him breathing behind me for 5 seconds before he attacked. 5 seconds. He stood there and looked at a blind man and decided, easy target. 5 seconds, Jeff. I memorized how he smelled. Cheap cigarettes and sweat. If I ever smell that combination again, I'll know him. But before we go any further, remember one thing. In this story, there is a moment that almost nobody knows about. A moment in a barber shop on 133rd Street when Bumpy Johnson spoke 7 words, quietly, looking at a black ebony cane lying across his knees. 7 words that explain everything. Why he did what he did to the man who robbed Ray Charles. Why he did it exactly the way he did it. And why this story became the legend that all of Harlem still tells to this day. Those 7 words are the most important part of everything you will hear today, but we will get to them at the very end, because to truly understand them, you first need to walk the entire path, from the broken glasses on wet asphalt to the last chord in an empty Carnegie Hall. Jeff Brown helped Ray into the back seat of the Cadillac, wrapped his bleeding hands in a handkerchief, drove 3 blocks to the Hotel Teresa on 125th Street, the Waldorf of Harlem, they called it. 4th floor, room 412. Jeff called a doctor first for the hands. The doctor arrived in 20 minutes, cleaned the scrapes, confirmed nothing was broken, and wrapped the fingers in gauze that made Ray's hands look like a boxer's between rounds. Then Jeff called the police. 2 officers arrived 40 minutes later, took a report, asked Ray to describe the attacker. Ray, a blind man, told them everything he could. Height estimated by the angle of the breathing, weight estimated by the force of the grab, the smell of cheap cigarettes and nervous sweat, The sound of the footsteps, a man who ran on his toes, probably thin, probably young. The officers wrote it down with the enthusiasm of men who already knew this report would end up in a drawer and never come out. Then Jeff made a third call. If you want to find out how this incredible story ends, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. The third call was the one that mattered, not to the police, who wouldn't lift a finger for a robbed black man in Harlem in 1961, not to a lawyer who couldn't recover cash that had no serial numbers recorded. Jeff called a number that everyone who worked in Harlem entertainment knew, but that only those who had nowhere else to turn actually dialed. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, deep, unhurried, the voice of a man who was not accustomed to being woken up, but who answered every call because you never knew which call would be the one that mattered. But to understand what that phone call set in motion, to understand why the man on the other end of that line would turn the next 43 hours into something that Harlem would talk about for decades, you need to understand who picked up the phone. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The streets called him Bumpy, a childhood nickname from a bump on the back of his head that he'd carried since a fight at age 11. He was 60 years old. He had been running Harlem, not officially, not with a title or a badge, but in every way that actually mattered, for over 25 years. His operation brought in an estimated $200,000 a month through numbers rackets, protection, and various enterprises that operated in the gray space between illegal and essential. But Bumpy Johnson was not a typical gangster, and anyone who made the mistake of treating him like one rarely made that mistake twice. Bumpy Johnson was a man who weighed every word, like a jeweler weighs gold. In 30 years on the streets of Harlem, those closest to him could count on one hand the moments when he said something that changed the expressions on people's faces. One of those moments, in a barber shop, 40 hours after this phone call, was still ahead. He read books, not occasionally, voraciously. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man he'd read twice. James Baldwin, Langston Hughes. He could quote Shakespeare from memory, a skill he'd acquired during one of his multiple stays in prison, where he'd decided that if the state was going to take his freedom, he would use the time to take something back. Knowledge. He wrote poetry. Not good poetry by his own admission, but the act of writing, of choosing words, arranging them, forcing meaning into form, had taught him something that the streets had not. That language was a weapon more precise than any blade. He dressed impeccably, every day, not flashy, impeccable. The difference mattered to him. A gold chain was flashy. A perfectly cut suit in muted tones with a silk pocket square, folded just so, that was authority made visible. His trademark was a black ebony cane, not because he limped, but because a cane commanded space. People moved aside for a man with a cane, and the silver handle was heavy enough to crack a cheekbone, which had happened exactly twice in the last decade, both times to men who had earned it. And Bumpy had a code, not written, not posted, not discussed, but understood by everyone who operated within his sphere. The code was simple. There are people you do not touch, artists, musicians. There are people, the elderly, children, the disabled, anyone who could not defend themselves. These people were under his protection, not because they asked, not because they paid, but because Bumpy Johnson believed that a man who allowed the weak to be preyed upon in his territory was not a man at all. Ray Charles, blind, black, brilliant, fit every category of protection that Bumpy's code demanded, and someone had beaten him, on Bumpy's territory, for his blindness. The phone call from Jeff Brown came in at 2:14 in the morning, Saturday, the 7th of October. Bumpy listened, did not interrupt, did not ask questions. 3 minutes. When Jeff finished, Bumpy said nothing. 9 seconds of silence. His wife, Mamie, lying next to him in bed, would later say that she felt the air in the room change, as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. Bumpy hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, turned on the bedside lamp. Mamie saw his face, perfectly calm, perfectly still. He picked up the phone again, dialed a number, then another, then another. 4 calls in 7 minutes. Each conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. Each conversation ended with the same 2 words, "By dawn." He did not go back to bed. He walked to the living room, sat in the armchair by the window, and opened his book, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. He read. He waited for dawn. Mamie, from the bedroom, heard him turning pages, slowly, evenly, as if nothing had happened. This frightened her more than anything. The thing about Bumpy Johnson that most people never understood, the thing that made him more dangerous than any man with a gun, was patience. He never rushed, never reacted in anger, never made a move without seeing the entire board first. And right now, at 2:30 in the morning on October 7th, sitting in his armchair reading about invisible men, while 4 phone calls rippled outward through the sleeping streets of Harlem like shock waves from a stone dropped in still water, he was not angry. He was something worse than angry. He was thinking. Meanwhile, those 4 phone calls woke 20 more people. By 4 in the morning, the network was activated. By 5, the question, "Who robbed the blind man at the Apollo?" was being asked in every late-night establishment in Harlem. This was not a request. This was an order marked urgent, and everyone in Harlem knew what urgent from Bumpy meant. If you know something and stay silent, you're next. By 6:11 Saturday morning, Bumpy was in his armchair with his 3rd cup of black coffee when the phone rang. Junior, his right hand, his shadow, the man who had stood beside him for 20 years, had the answer. Name's Leroy Pullins. They call him Stick, 26 years old, junkie, heroin, lives on 141st Street. He was bragging at Minton's around midnight, told 3 people he took the blind man for 12 grand. The bartender confirmed. 2 shoeshine boys confirmed. His dealer confirmed. Bumpy did not write anything down. He memorized. "A junkie," he repeated, and on his face appeared an expression that Mamie had seen only 4 times in 30 years together. Not a smile. Something worse than a smile. "A junkie. That's good. That's very good, because I know what a junkie needs, and I know how to make sure he doesn't get it." Bumpy closed the book on page 213. He stood up, put on his dark blue suit, his Stetson hat, picked up the ebony cane, and walked out into Saturday morning Harlem to do something he had not done in years, personally oversee the dismantling of one man's entire world. Remember those 7 words I mentioned at the beginning? Right now, as Bumpy described to Junior how to turn $12,000 into worthless paper, how to make a man with pockets full of cash unable to buy a glass of water, right now, those words were being born inside his head. He hadn't spoken them yet, but they already existed. Now let's get back to what happened next, because within 3 hours, Leroy Pullins was about to walk out his front door and discover that Harlem was no longer his home. One order, and Harlem ceased to exist for Leroy Stick Pullins. Not gradually, not one establishment at a time, all at once, within 2 hours, as if someone flipped a switch and the entire neighborhood went dark. 9:15 Saturday morning, dealer Tommy Fisher received a visit. 2 men, 30 seconds of conversation. Tommy went pale. No more heroin for Stick. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Not until Bumpy Johnson said otherwise. 9:30, 5 pawn shops between 100 and 10th and 155th Street received a description. Gold Breitling Navy timer watch, gold cufflinks. Anyone who brings them in, hold them and call this number. Anyone who buys them will answer personally. 10 o'clock, 12 bars closed their doors to Pullens. His picture, a pencil sketch done from memory by one of Bumpy's men who'd seen him at Minton's, was pinned under every bar counter between the rivers. 10:30, the Greyhound bus terminal, the train station, taxi stands, even the unlicensed gypsy cab drivers, all warned. Pullens doesn't leave. No ticket, no ride, no way out. 11 o'clock, every flophouse, every shooting gallery, every basement where a man could sleep for 50 cents, closed. His name sounded like a curse. Stick Pullens? Never heard of him. Don't come back. By noon, Harlem had become a cage 150 blocks long, bounded by rivers on two sides and Bumpy Johnson's will on the other two, and Leroy Pullens, who at that very moment was waking up on a stained mattress on 141st Street with $12,000 under his pillow, a Breitling watch on his wrist, and the certainty that he had just pulled off the score of his life, had no idea. He felt like a king. In 1 hour, he would discover he was prey. Here is what no one ever tells you about power. Real power. The kind that doesn't need a badge or a gun or a title. Real power is the ability to make a man with $12,000 in his pocket unable to buy a cup of coffee. Real power is turning money into paper, turning a neighborhood into a prison, turning every familiar face into a closed door. And Bumpy Johnson was about to demonstrate exactly that kind of power, on a scale that even Harlem, a neighborhood that had seen everything, had never witnessed before. Saturday afternoon, 1 o'clock. Pullens stepped out into the October sunlight. The air was cool. The streets were full. Saturday Harlem, bustling, alive. He didn't know that every second person on the sidewalk already knew his name and his face. He walked south toward Lenox Avenue with the rolling, confident stride of a man who believed the universe had finally done him a favor. 18 hours since his last fix. His hands were starting to shake. Not badly, just a tremor, like a tuning fork struck lightly. But the itch was there, under the skin, building. He needed heroin. That was the first priority. Then food. Then maybe, for the first time in years, some new clothes. Shoes without holes. A coat that didn't smell like other people's misery. Door number 1. Tommy Fisher, corner of 143rd and Lenox. Tommy was there, leaning against the lamppost, counting something in his palm. Pullens approached, pulled out a crisp 20 from the stolen envelope. Tommy looked at the bill, then at Pullens, then at the bill again. Not today, Stick. Then at Pullens. I was told. You're clean until further notice. Pullens blinked, offered double, triple. Tommy turned and walked away without another word. Door number 3, second dealer 2 blocks south. Same answer. Get away from me, Stick. Door number 5, third dealer on 7th Avenue. The door closed in his face before he could speak. Door number 8, Red's Bar on 138th. The bartender pointed at the exit without looking up from the glass he was polishing. No words, just a finger, aimed at the door, steady as a compass needle. Door number 12, the pawn shop on Lenox. Pullens tried to sell the Breitling for half its value. Just give him cash, different cash, cash that wasn't connected to anything. The owner reached under the counter and pressed a button. Wait right here, he said, and something in his voice, something flat and final, made Pullens run. He was out the door and halfway down the block before he heard someone calling after him. Door number 16, the Greyhound terminal on 126th. Pullens at the counter, sweating now, the tremor in his hands visible. 1 ticket to Philadelphia. The cashier looked at him for a long time. No tickets available. Pullens could see the departure board behind her. Bus to Philadelphia in 20 minutes, half the seats empty. No tickets available, she repeated, and her eyes said everything her words did not. Door number 20, a flophouse on 136th. No vacancy. Pullens could see empty cots through the open doorway. Door number 23, the last door. Not a bar, not a dealer, not a flophouse. An old man on the corner of 140th and 7th Avenue. They called him Ash, a drifter, a nobody, the kind of man who survived on the margins by knowing everything and threatening no one. The last person in Harlem who would still speak to Leroy Stick Pullens. The last person. Pullens was lying on the concrete floor of an abandoned building, and the only thing he could see in the basement darkness were his own trembling hands. He didn't know that 3 blocks from that basement, Bumpy Johnson was calmly reading a book about invisible men and carrying 7 words inside him like a loaded weapon, waiting only for morning to speak them aloud. Ash looked at Pullens the way people look at a man who's already gone but doesn't know it yet. Pullens was shaking badly now. 22 hours without heroin, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the October chill, his skin crawling with the phantom sensation of insects beneath the surface. His eyes were wild. "What's happening, Ash? Why won't anyone sell to me? Why won't anyone talk to me?" Ash studied him for 5 seconds, then spoke as if reading a headstone. "You don't know. You really don't know. Stick, you robbed Ray Charles, and Ray Charles is Bumpy's guest. Bumpy Johnson is looking for you, and he already found you. He just hasn't come for you yet." The name landed like a fist. "Bumpy Johnson," Pullens whispered. "You understand what I'm telling you. He knows where you are right now. He knows where you'll go. He knows where you'll sleep tonight. He knows everything. But he's not coming. You understand? He is not coming, because he doesn't need to hurry. You're already in the cage. The cage is just the size of Harlem." Pullens' legs gave way. He sat down on the curb, $12,000 in his jacket pocket, a gold Breitling on his wrist, gold cufflinks in his pants pocket, and the absolute crushing realization that none of it mattered. Not 1 cent, not 1 jewel. He was the richest beggar in New York City, and every door in the world was locked. By 10 that night, the withdrawal hit full force, sweating, cramping, vomiting in a corner of the abandoned building's basement on 137th Street, where he'd crawled to hide, his body convulsing, his teeth chattering. The money spread around him on the concrete. He had pulled it out during the night, counted it with unsteady fingers again and again, as if counting would make it work, as if the next time he counted, some door somewhere would open. The hands. That was the image that defined the night. His hands, the hands that 12 hours ago had seized a briefcase, removed a watch from a wrist, taken everything from a man who could not see. Those hands now trembled so strongly that he could not light a cigarette. 7 matches flared and faded between restless fingers. The 8th caught, and he did not notice the flame reaching his skin until it was too late. Mirror image, the hands of Ray Charles, feeling across the asphalt for broken glasses. The hands of the one who robbed him, feeling through the darkness for a match, both navigating without sight in different ways. By midnight, Leroy Pullens lay curled on the basement floor, $12,000 scattered around him like confetti at a gathering no one wanted to attend, and for the first time in 10 years, he broke down completely. Not quietly, not with composure, with the raw, unguarded sound of a man who has realized that he is inside a situation so perfectly constructed, so completely sealed, so elegantly designed that there is no exit except through the man who arranged it. Somewhere, 3 blocks north, in a warm apartment on 150th Street, Bumpy Johnson rested peacefully. Because tomorrow morning, Sunday, he had a visit to make. Not to Pullens, not yet. First to Ray Charles. Because Bumpy Johnson, for all his reputation, for all the weight his name carried in every corner of Harlem, was above all a man with a code. And the code said, look after the one who was wronged first, then turn your attention to the one who did the wrong first. And right now, in this exact second, as Bumpy rested and Pullens lay broken on a concrete floor and Ray Charles sat in a hotel room with bandaged fingers listening to silence, those 7 words were crossing from thought into decision. Bumpy had not spoken them yet. That would happen in 4 hours, in a barber shop on 133rd Street, when Pullens would be sitting before him with a blindfold over his eyes. And when Bumpy finally said those 7 words, Junior, a man who had spent 20 years beside Bumpy and had seen everything the streets of Harlem could offer and thought nothing could surprise him anymore, would lower his eyes and fall silent for a full minute. Not from fear. From the understanding that in 30 years beside this man, he was hearing his true code for the first time. Not in actions, but in words. What exactly did Bumpy say? Soon, but first, Sunday morning, because Bumpy Johnson had a promise to keep. Sunday, the 8th of October, 11 o'clock in the morning, Hotel Teresa, 125th Street and 7th Avenue, 4th floor, room 412. Ray Charles sat in an armchair by the window, a window through which he would never see the view of Harlem stretching north toward the Bronx. His hands were bandaged. The fingers were intact, but the knuckles were scraped raw. No replacement glasses yet. A spare pair was being shipped from New Jersey. Without the dark glasses, his face looked exposed, vulnerable, closed eyelids that the world rarely witnessed. A knock at the door. Jeff opened it. On the threshold, a man of 60 in an immaculate beige linen suit, hat in his hand. Behind him, no one. He came alone. Bumpy entered. Ray heard his footsteps, heavy, confident, with the light tap of a cane on hardwood floor. Ray turned his head precisely in the direction of the sound. The uncanny accuracy of a man who had spent 25 years building a world from sound alone. Bumpy sat down opposite him, said nothing for 10 seconds, then spoke, so quietly that Jeff, across the room, couldn't make out the words. Mr. Charles, my name is Johnson. I am ashamed. I am ashamed that this happened in my neighborhood. You are a guest of Harlem, and Harlem failed you. I came to tell you that your belongings will be returned to you by sundown. All of them, every last cent. And the man who did this will never raise his hand against a defenseless person again. Ray was silent. Then, you're Bumpy Johnson. I know who you are. People have told me about you. They said I should be afraid of you, but the voice I'm hearing doesn't sound like a man to be afraid of. It sounds like a man who feels shame, and that's a rare thing in my world. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. Mr. Charles, I have spent my entire life doing things I don't apologize for. But what happened to you, that was not a crime against a wallet. That was a crime against dignity. Someone looked at you and saw not a genius, not an artist, not a human being, but a weakness. They turned your blindness into a target. I cannot give you back your sight, Mr. Charles, but I can make sure that the man who saw weakness in your blindness will wish he'd never had eyes at all. Ray smiled, for the first time in 2 days. You're an interesting man, Mr. Johnson. You read books. I can tell by the way you construct sentences. What are you reading now? Invisible Man. Ray laughed, short, rough, from somewhere deep in his chest. Invisible Man? Yes, we're all invisible in this country. Only I'm an invisible man who can't even see the people he's invisible to. Bumpy stood, put on his hat, and walked to the door. On the threshold, he turned. Mr. Charles, when I return your things, and I will return them today, I'd like to ask you for one favor. Not now. Later, when this is all over, I would like you to play something for me. Personally, just for me. You'll know what when you hear how this ends. Ray nodded. Bumpy left and headed to finish what he'd started, because somewhere in a basement, trembling and weeping, was a man who was about to have the longest day of his life. Sunday, the 8th of October, 3:26 in the afternoon. Two of Bumpy's men found Leroy Stick Pullins in the basement of the abandoned building on 137th Street. He was lying on the concrete floor in the fetal position, 36 hours without heroin. His body had turned against him with a vengeance that no drug dealer could match. Every muscle cramping, every joint screaming, sweat pouring from skin that felt like it was being peeled away inch by inch from the inside. His teeth chattered so violently that one of the men later said it sounded like a sewing machine running at full speed. Vomit on the floor beside him. Tears on his face, not fresh, but dried in streaks, the residue of hours of weeping that had exhausted itself into a hollow, vacant stare at the concrete wall. The $12,000 was scattered around him in loose bills and envelopes. During the night, in the delirious fog of withdrawal, he had pulled the money out and counted it over and over, as if repetition could unlock the invisible doors that Bumpy Johnson had sealed shut across every block of Harlem. The Breitling watch was still on his wrist. The gold cufflinks were in his pants pocket. Everything he had stolen was still there. Every cent, every object, and none of it, not a single dollar, not a single piece of gold, had been able to buy him a glass of water, a crumb of bread, a milligram of heroin, or a seat on a bus going anywhere. The two men took him by the arms. He didn't resist. He couldn't resist. His legs buckled on the basement stairs, and they had to half carry him to the street. Sunlight hit his face, and he flinched like a man who'd been living underground for weeks, not hours. A black Lincoln Continental waited at the curb. They put him in the back seat. Beside him, the briefcase, the envelopes, the watch, the cufflinks. Everything recovered. Everything accounted for. The car drove 4 minutes, stopped outside the barber shop on 133rd Street. Johnny's barber shop, 6 chairs, a checkered floor, the smell of barbicide and aftershave that had seeped into the walls over decades. Sunday, closed to regular customers, but the light was on inside, and through the glass door, Pullins could see figures standing in the dim interior. They pulled him out of the car. His legs failed on the steps. They steadied him, pushed open the door. The bell above it rang, a cheerful, ordinary sound that belonged to Saturday haircuts and Sunday morning gossip, not to what was about to happen. The barber shop looked different from any ordinary day. 6 barber chairs lined the wall, but one, the center chair, had been turned to face the door. In it sat Bumpy Johnson, legs crossed. The black ebony cane lay across his knees like a scepter. The Stetson hat hung on a hook to his right. A book, Invisible Man, sat on the neighboring chair, closed, with a bookmark at page 213. Behind Bumpy stood 4 men, not muscle-bound enforcers, not scarred street soldiers, ordinary men in ordinary suits, but their faces expressed nothing, and it was precisely that nothing that was more terrifying than any snarl or threat. 4 faces as blank as fresh concrete, waiting to be written on. Pullens was placed in the chair opposite Bumpy, a regular barber's chair, chrome armrests, cracked leather seat, footrest, the kind of chair where men sat to get a shave and talk about the Dodgers. But for Leroy Pullens, in this moment, it might as well have been the last seat he would ever occupy. Bumpy did not stand, did not raise his voice, spoke so quietly that Pullens had to lean forward to hear, and that involuntary movement, that instinctive submission, humiliated him more deeply than any blow could have. Sit. Pullens sat, or rather, collapsed into the chair, his body folding like a marionette with cut strings. Bumpy looked at him for 30 seconds, silent, unblinking. The only sound in the barber shop was the tick of a wall clock above the mirror and the faint, wet, ragged breathing of a man in the grip of heroin withdrawal. Pullens broke first. He began to speak, to babble, really, a torrent of words that tumbled over each other in their rush to escape. He was sorry. He didn't know. He needed the money for a fix. He didn't know who Ray Charles was a guest of. He would give everything back. Please, everything, all of it, please. Bumpy raised one finger, the index finger of his right hand, just raised it about 6 inches off the cane and held it there. Pullens stopped mid-word, as if someone had cut his vocal cords. "You robbed a blind man." Bumpy's voice was barely above a whisper. Not just any blind man, Ray Charles, a man who sees the world better than you ever will. You hit him in the face. You tore his watch from his wrist, a gift from his wife. You ripped out his cufflinks, a gift from a friend. You took his money. You did all of this because he is blind, because you decided that a blind man cannot fight back, that a blind man is easy prey. Pause. The clock ticked. 6 ticks. 7. Do you know what a blind man feels when he is attacked from behind? No? Then I'll show you. Bumpy nodded. One of the men reached under the counter and produced a strip of black cloth, thick, opaque, the kind of fabric that lets nothing through, not a sliver of light, not a shadow, nothing. He stepped behind Pullens and tied it over his eyes. Pullens jerked, tried to raise his hands. 2 others held his shoulders. The knot tightened at the back of his skull. Darkness, total, absolute. The same darkness that Ray Charles had lived in every second of every day since he was 6 years old. The same darkness that Pullens had exploited, that he had seen as weakness, as opportunity, as the reason to choose this particular victim on this particular night in this particular alley. Now it was his. And Bumpy rose from the chair with that expression on his face, the one that Junior would see once more in just a few minutes, when he heard 7 words that would make him lower his eyes and fall silent for a full minute. Bumpy stood, his footsteps slow, heavy, deliberate, punctuated by the tap of the ebony cane on the tile floor, circled the chair. Tap, tap, tap. Pullens heard them, heard the cane strike the floor behind him, beside him, in front of him. The sound moved in a slow orbit around his chair like a predator circling wounded prey. The footsteps stopped behind him. Pullens felt breath on the back of his neck, someone else's breath, close, warm, the same way Ray Charles had felt Pullens' breath in the alley, those 5 seconds of breathing before the attack. The 5 seconds when the blind man knew someone was there, but could do nothing. 5 seconds, Bumpy said from directly behind Pullens' left ear. Mr. Charles told me that you stood behind him for 5 seconds before you attacked. He heard your breathing. He knew you were there. He couldn't do anything. 5 seconds of waiting for a blow you can't see coming. Let's count together. Silence. 1. Pullens trembled. 2. Tears soaked through the blindfold, darkening the black fabric. 3. He was whispering something, a prayer, an apology, a plea to God or to Bumpy or to anyone who would listen. 4. The cane struck the floor once, hard, right next to his ear. Pullens screamed, a short, sharp animal sound that bounced off the tile walls and the mirrors and the chrome fixtures of the barber shop. 5. Pause. Long. 10 seconds. 20. Pullens didn't know what was coming next. He couldn't see. He was blind. For the first time in his 26 years of life, truly, completely, helplessly blind. And in that blindness, every sound became a threat. The creak of a chair, the rustle of fabric, footsteps. Where? From which direction? What was about to happen? Mr. Charles lives like this every day. Bumpy's voice came from somewhere to the left now. Every hour, every minute, darkness, forever. And you decided that makes him weak. The footsteps circled again. Tap, tap, tap. This was the moment, the exact moment, when Bumpy Johnson stood behind a blindfolded junkie in a barber shop on 133rd Street and understood something that had been forming in his mind for 40 hours. Those 7 words were crossing from thought into decision, from feeling into language, from instinct into code. He would speak them in a few minutes, after Pullens left, and they would explain not just this punishment, but every punishment he had ever administered, every person he had ever protected, every law he had ever laid down on the streets of Harlem. We are almost there. But first, Bumpy had one more thing to show this man. Do you know what I wanted to do to you? My people suggested options, specific options, regarding your eyes, so that you could also learn what permanent darkness looks like. Not a blindfold that can be removed. Real darkness. Forever. Pullens sobbed. Not quietly, not with restraint. The full, broken, wailing sound of a child. A 26-year-old man reduced to a child by darkness and fear, and the voice of a 60-year-old man who spoke about permanent blindness the way other people spoke about the weather. But I'm not going to do that. Do you know why? Because Mr. Charles, a man you robbed, a man you struck in the face, a man whose blindness you treated as weakness, Mr. Charles turned his blindness into a gift. He made music that makes the whole world weep. And you use your eyes only to hunt for victims. And you don't deserve even his punishment. Bumpy sat back down. The cane settled across his knees. Take off the blindfold. One of the men untied the cloth. Light flooded Pullens' eyes. Ordinary barbershop light, fluorescent tubes, and a desk lamp. Nothing special. But after the darkness, it was blinding. He blinked, squinted, tears. His vision cleared. And the first thing he saw, the very first image that entered his newly restored sight, was the face of Bumpy Johnson, 2 steps away, looking at him with an expression that contained no anger, no hatred, no satisfaction, only a kind of terrible ancient patience. The patience of a man who has seen every variation of human weakness and has decided, long ago, exactly how to respond to each one. Here are my terms, the only terms, not subject to negotiation. Bumpy raised his hand and began folding fingers one by one. First, every cent, every watch, every cufflink goes back to Mr. Charles today. This is already done. My people found everything on you. Second, you will write him a letter, not an apology, an explanation. Why you did what you did. Honest. I will read it before it's sent. If there is a single dishonest word in it, I'll know. Third, you leave Harlem. Forever. I don't care where, the Bronx, Brooklyn, New Jersey, the moon. But if I learn that you've come back, there will be no conversation. Fourth, Bumpy leaned forward, close enough that Pullens could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something darker, like old leather-bound books. Fourth, every year in October you will go to the New York Association for the Blind on West 40th Street and work as a volunteer, free, for a full month. Every October, for the rest of your life. My people will check, and if you miss even one October... Bumpy took the cane and slowly, carefully, almost gently, placed its tip on Pullen's knee. "Do you understand me?" Pullens nodded. Speaking was beyond him. His throat was locked. "I can't hear you." Yes, it was locked. "I understand. I'll do everything. Everything you said. Please what? Please, don't take my eyes." Silence in the barber shop. 8 men. No one moved. Bumpy looked at Pullens for 5 seconds. Exactly 5, as if measuring time by an internal clock, and spoke the last words Leroy Pullens would ever hear him say. "Every morning when you open your eyes, remember that you see the sunrise only because I allowed it. Remember that. And remember Ray Charles, who will never in his life see a single sunrise. Now get out of my Harlem. You have 2 hours." Pullens stumbled out of the barber shop at 4:15 in the afternoon. His legs wouldn't hold him. He fell on the steps, got up, walked down 133rd Street, without money, without a watch, without cufflinks, without a single cent. People on the sidewalk watched him and looked away. Everyone already knew. All of Harlem already knew. 2 hours later, he was seen at the Greyhound terminal. This time, the cashier sold him a ticket. One ticket, one way, to Baltimore. Bumpy had allowed it. The door of the barber shop closed behind Pullens, and the bell above it rang one final time. That same cheerful, ordinary sound. Inside, Junior stood near the counter. The 4 men stood along the wall. Nobody spoke. Bumpy sat in the chair. He didn't move. He looked down at the ebony cane lying across his knees. His fingers traced the silver handle. Slowly, absently, the way a man touches something that holds meaning no one else can see. Junior waited. He had learned in 20 years that the most important things Bumpy said came after the longest silences. 30 seconds. A minute. Then Bumpy spoke. 7 words. Quietly, almost to himself, as if he were reading an inscription that only he could see, carved into the dark wood of the cane. Junior heard them, and lowered his eyes, and said nothing for a full minute. Not from fear, from understanding, from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that in all his years beside this man, through wars and truces, through raids and escapes, through fortune and ruin and fortune again, he had never heard Bumpy express in words the principle that had governed every single thing he had ever done, until now. 3 hours earlier, in that barber shop, after Pullens walked out on trembling legs and the door closed behind him, Bumpy stayed in the chair. Junior stood beside him. 4 men were silent, and Bumpy, looking at the black ebony cane lying across his knees, spoke 7 words, quietly, almost to himself, 7 words that you will learn in just a few minutes, because we are almost there. But first, Ray Charles held a broken cufflink in one hand and a letter in the other, and said something that made even Junior, who had just heard those 7 words, feel his throat tighten. At 6 o'clock, Sunday evening, the sun was setting behind the rooftops of Harlem. Red and gold light flooded 125th Street, turning the brownstones into something that almost looked like a painting, warm, rich, beautiful in a way that the neighborhood rarely allowed itself to appear. Hotel Teresa, 4th floor, room 412. A knock at the door. Jeff opened it. Junior stood on the threshold. In his hands, the brown leather briefcase with brass latches and the monogram RCIR. Junior entered, set the briefcase on the table in front of Ray, opened it. Inside, 2 envelopes. Ray reached out, bandaged hands, scraped knuckles, and felt the envelopes with his fingertips, counted the bills by touch. His fingers moved with the precision of a concert pianist sight-reading a score, which, in a sense, was exactly what he was. All $12,000, every cent. Junior reached into his jacket pocket and produced the Breitling Navy timer, placed it in Ray's open palm. Ray's fingers slid over the knurled bezel, the same bezel he'd been reading for years, the tactile clock face that connected him to a world he couldn't see. The watch was intact. The hands were moving. Ray lifted it to his ear and listened to the ticking. Quiet, steady, familiar. The heartbeat of a timepiece that had made a round trip through hell and come back alive. Then the cufflinks, gold, one intact, the second, the left one, with a broken fastener, torn where Pullens had ripped it from Ray's cuff along with the fabric. Mr. Johnson sends his apologies for the cufflink, Junior said. The fastener can be repaired. Mr. Johnson has already arranged for the best jeweler on 47th Street to fix it, at his expense. Ray held the broken cufflink in his fingers, Quincy's gift, turned it over and over, feeling the bend in the metal where force had twisted it, the sharp edge where the clasp had snapped. "Mr. Charles," Jeff's voice from across the room. "I'm fine, Jeff. I'm just trying to remember the last time a stranger did something for me simply because it was right. Not for money, not for fame, because it was right." Junior produced a final item from his inside pocket, a white envelope, unsealed, no name on the outside. "Mr. Johnson asked me to deliver this personally. He said you'd understand." Jeff took the envelope, opened it, unfolded a single sheet of cheap paper, read aloud. The handwriting was rough, the penmanship of a man who had not written anything longer than a grocery list in years. The words were simple, the grammar was imperfect, but the honesty, the raw, unpolished, undeniable honesty, filled the room like smoke. "Mr. Charles, I robbed you because you are blind, and I thought you could not fight back. I am a drug addict. I needed money for a fix. I did not think of you as a person. I thought of you as a wallet that couldn't run away. That is the truth, and I am ashamed of it. I was told who you are. I was told what you do for people with your music, and I was told what I did. I didn't steal money. I stole dignity from a man who has more of it than any seeing person I have ever known. Forgive me if you can. Leroy Pullens." Ray listened, silent. Then, "Did he write this himself?" Junior. "Mr. Johnson made him rewrite it 3 times. The first 2 times, lies. Mr. Johnson can spot a lie from the first word. 3rd time, this. Mr. Johnson said, 'Now it sounds like the truth.'" Ray folded the letter, placed it in his breast pocket, next to his heart. "Tell Mr. Johnson this. I have played for presidents. I have played for millionaires. I have played for stadiums, but no one has ever returned my dignity along with my watch. Tell him I remember his request. He wanted me to play something for him. I will play whenever he wants, wherever he wants. For a man who protected a blind man, I will play for free and with joy." Junior, watching as Ray Charles placed the letter next to his heart, remembered the barber shop and the 7 words, and for the first time truly understood that Bumpy had meant every word, literally every word, and that those 7 words were not about Pullens and not about Ray Charles, but about everyone Bumpy had ever protected. The ripple effect began before Pullens' bus reached the New Jersey state line. By Monday morning, one day after the resolution, the story had traveled to every corner of Harlem, not as gossip, as law. Every retelling added a detail. By Wednesday, Pullens in the popular imagination wasn't just crying. He was on his knees, begging, blubbering like an infant. The blindfold became legend. Bumpy showed him the eternal night, people whispered. The tap of the cane behind the blindfolded man's chair, that sound was repeated in hushed tones, and everyone who heard it instinctively looked over their shoulder. But more important than the retellings was the result. 1 week after the incident, Sammy Davis Jr. performed at the Apollo. 3 shows over 2 days. At the service exit, 2 men, not hired by the promoters, not paid by the management, sent by Bumpy. They stood there, silent, watchful, unremarkable, and every person who walked past them understood what their presence meant. 2 weeks later, Nina Simone at Minton's Playhouse. After the show, a taxi to her hotel. The driver was one of Bumpy's, door to door, no charge. 1 month later, Duke Ellington returned to Harlem for a series of engagements. His manager contacted Bumpy's people in advance, not out of fear, out of the knowledge that under Bumpy's protection, Harlem was safer than any other neighborhood in New York City. What nobody ever tells you about real change, the kind that reshapes a neighborhood, a community, a way of life, is that it rarely comes from legislation or protest or grand speeches. Sometimes it comes from one man, one night, one act of justice so precise, so complete, so unforgettable that it rewrites the unwritten rules that everyone lives by. And Bumpy Johnson, in a barber shop on 133rd Street, with a strip of black cloth and 5 seconds of counting and a cane tapping on tile, had just rewritten the rules of Harlem. The unspoken rule crystallized into an oral law, passed from bartender to bartender, dealer to dealer, bouncer to bouncer. Artists are untouchable. Musicians, singers, dancers, actors, anyone who comes to Harlem to perform is under protection. Anyone who touches an artist answers to Bumpy, personally. And after the Pullen story, everyone in Harlem knew exactly what answering to Bumpy personally looked like. But the rule expanded beyond artists. Bumpy extended it to everyone he classified as defenseless, the elderly, the disabled, children. This wasn't a formal decree. Bumpy didn't issue proclamations. It was an understanding that spread through his network like electricity through copper. There are people you do not touch, and the list of those people was determined by one man. Bumpy explained it simply when the owner of Minton's Playhouse asked whether he should pay for artist security. Pay? For protecting musicians? Mr. Henry, let me explain something to you. A musician comes to Harlem and plays for our people. He gives them 3 hours of happiness. 3 hours when they forget that they live in a ghetto, that the police despise them, that America pretends they don't exist. 3 hours of music is more than I can give these people in a lifetime. So no, you will not pay for security. I will pay for security. I will pay with the privilege of living in Harlem. Because Harlem without music is just a collection of dirty blocks. But Harlem with music is the capital of Black America, and I intend to defend it. 2 silent men at the service exit of the Apollo. Every night, every show, for the next several years. They never spoke, never threatened, just stood. And their presence alone was enough to ensure that no Leroy Poulins ever approached that door with bad intentions again. Not once, not in the entire decade that followed, because 80% of success depends on precedent. If it works once, it can work again, and again, and again. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just punished a thief. He had created a precedent, a template, a story that did the work of 100 enforcers simply by being told. Bumpy's rule held perfectly. Not a single artist was robbed in Harlem for the next 10 years. But every law has a cost, and Bumpy's code was no exception, because protecting the weak meant punishing the strong, and punishing the strong meant creating enemies. And while Bumpy built his code of honor on the streets of Harlem, men in high offices, men with badges and warrants and the full weight of the federal government, were building plans to tear that code down. But that was later. Right now, Bumpy was waiting for one phone call. A call from a man in Los Angeles. A man who had promised to play for him. 3 months passed. January 1962. Baltimore, Maryland. Leroy Stick Pullins rented a room in a flophouse on Pennsylvania Avenue. Worked as a dishwasher in a diner for $22 a week. The heroin was gone. The withdrawal he'd endured during those 36 hours in Harlem had been so catastrophic, so total in its physical devastation, that his body had simply refused to go back. Every morning he woke up and lay still for 3 seconds with his eyes closed, then opened them, saw the ceiling, cracked plaster, a bare light bulb, and every morning, every single morning without exception, he remembered the words, "Every morning when you open your eyes, remember that you see the sunrise only because I allowed it." He remembered every morning. Meanwhile, Bumpy, 1962, 61 years old, his power in Harlem at its peak. But his health was failing. Heart problems, blood pressure, the accumulated toll of years in prisons where medical care meant aspirin and prayer. He spent more time in the barber shop reading. Invisible Man had been read twice. Now, James Baldwin, Another Country. Bumpy underlined a sentence in pencil. Anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. He thought about Pullins, not with pity, with understanding. A junkie robbed a blind man not because he was born evil, but because the system had made him so desperate that another person's blindness became an opportunity. Bumpy knew this. Bumpy had once been that person, a desperate young man from South Carolina who arrived in Harlem with $5 and a rage against the world. The difference, Bumpy found a code. Pullins hadn't. Until that Saturday in the barber shop. By autumn of 1962, Bumpy received a report from his man stationed outside the Association for the Blind on West 40th Street. Pullins had completed the entire month of October. Not a single absence, not a single complaint. They had assigned him as an assistant instructor, helping blind people navigate streets, cross intersections, use public transportation. And more than that, he had asked to stay for November, voluntarily. Bumpy listened to this report, nodded, said one word, "Good," then returned to his book. The name Leroy Pullins was never spoken in his presence again. The thing about justice that most people misunderstand, the thing that separates punishment from transformation, is time. A beating takes 30 seconds and teaches nothing. A bullet takes 1 second and ends the conversation permanently. But what Bumpy Johnson did to Leroy Pullins, the closed doors, the invisible walls, the blindfold, the counting, the cane, that took 43 hours and lasted a lifetime. Because the punishment wasn't pain. The punishment was understanding, and understanding doesn't come from the fist. It comes from the mirror. And here's what no one expected, the part that even Bumpy may not have foreseen. Pullins discovered that he liked the work, that guiding a blind person through a crosswalk gave him something that heroin never had, a feeling that his hands, the same hands that had torn a briefcase from a blind musician's grip, were doing something right, something that mattered, something that justified their existence. October 1962. 1 year after the robbery, Pullins walked into the New York Association for the Blind. His hands were steady. He had been sober for 11 months. They assigned him the same position, assistant instructor, every day, free. A man in a gray overcoat sat on a bench across the street and read a newspaper. Every day, for the entire month, checking. Pullens completed his October and the next year. Checking. And the next. And the next. Even after Bumpy was gone, even after the man in the gray overcoat stopped appearing on the bench, Pullens kept coming. Not because he was afraid, Bumpy was no longer alive, there was no one left to fear, but because at some point, maybe the second year, maybe the third, the punishment had transformed into something else. Something Pullens couldn't name because he had never experienced anything like it in his entire life. The closest word was redemption, but Pullens didn't know words like that. He simply took a blind person's hand every October and led them across the street. And Ray Charles. 1962 became one of the most significant years of his career. The album Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, a black man singing the music of the White South, detonated every chart. The single I Can't Stop Loving You held the #1 position for 5 weeks. Ray toured the country, played 200 concerts a year, earned more than he ever had. The scraped knuckles had long healed. New Ray-Ban glasses, in place, the Breitling Navy timer with the knurled bezel on his wrist, the cufflink from Quincy, repaired by the jeweler on 47th Street at Bumpy's expense. If you looked closely, you could see a hairline seam where the solder joined the broken clasp. But Ray couldn't look closely. Ray could only feel, with his fingertips, the barely perceptible ridge of that repair. And every time he did, he remembered the night in the alley, the barber shop he'd never seen, and the man who smelled of sandalwood cologne and read books about invisible people. In March of 1962, Ray returned to New York. 3 concerts at Carnegie Hall, sold out, standing ovations. But before the first show, he asked Jeff to make a call, one specific call, to a number that Jeff had written down in October of the previous year. Ray Charles put down the phone. Bumpy Johnson put down the phone. Ray Charles, and in that moment, when a blind genius and a gangster with an ebony cane agreed to meet in an empty concert hall, Bumpy smiled. Junior didn't know the one thing, didn't know the 7 words that Bumpy had spoken in the barber shop after Pullens left. Bumpy would never repeat them. He spoke them only once to one person, himself, looking at the cane. And now, right now, I'm going to tell you, because you've walked this entire path, because you heard the crack of broken glasses on wet asphalt, and the tap of a cane behind a blindfolded man's back, and the ticking of a Breitling watch held to a blind man's ear, because you've earned the right to know what was behind all of this. But first, one evening in Carnegie Hall, because without that evening the 7 words won't sound the way they should. That evening in March of 1962, something happened that only 2 people knew about. The service entrance of Carnegie Hall, an empty auditorium, 2,800 seats, all of them vacant. One grand piano on the stage, its lid raised, the strings catching the faint light from a single work lamp. One blind genius at the keys, and one gangster in the 3rd row of the orchestra section, his ebony cane leaning against the seat beside him, his hat on the empty chair to his left, his hands folded in his lap. What Ray Charles played for Bumpy Johnson that evening, neither of them ever told anyone. Not a single soul. Not Jeff Brown, not Junior, not Mamie, not Della. Whatever those notes were, whatever melody filled that enormous empty space, it belonged only to the 2 of them, the man who couldn't see and the man who saw too much. But those who stood outside the service entrance and heard the music through the walls, a stagehand, a security guard, a woman who cleaned the dressing rooms, all said the same thing afterward. They had never, before or since, heard a piano sound like that.
as if the instrument was crying and laughing at the same time.
As if darkness and light had found a common language and were speaking it fluently, beautifully, without words, in a hall built for 3,000 people, but occupied by just 2. The concert lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, Bumpy stood. Ray heard the chair fold up, heard the footsteps approach the stage, heard the cane tap, tap, taps on the carpeted aisle. Bumpy stopped at the edge of the stage. He didn't go up, didn't try to shake hands, just stood there below the piano, looking up at the man who couldn't see him. "Thank you, Mr. Charles." "Did you get what you wanted, Mr. Johnson?" "More than I wanted, more than I deserved." Ray smiled. "Come back any time. The door is always open." Bumpy turned and walked out through the service entrance, into the March night, into the streets of a city that knew his name and feared it and respected it and would forget it and then remember it again, over and over for the next 60 years. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson, 62 years old, sat at his usual table by the wall. Before him, a plate of fried chicken and a glass of water. He was talking to a friend, laughing, telling a story, which story the friend could never afterward remember. Mid-sentence, Bumpy stopped speaking. His hand, holding the glass, relaxed. The glass tipped over. Water spread across the white tablecloth in a slow, expanding circle. Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes. He would not open them again. A heart attack, instantaneous. He left this world at his table, in his restaurant, in his Harlem, in the middle of a sentence, and in the middle of a laugh. As if life had decided that no better ending existed for such a man. The funeral of Bumpy Johnson, the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. Harlem had not seen such a funeral since Adam Clayton Powell Sr. The line of mourners stretched 4 blocks. Politicians, businessmen, musicians, preachers, teachers, bartenders, shoeshine boys, street vendors, former convicts, single mothers, old men from nursing homes, they all came. Because Bumpy Johnson had been to Harlem what no mayor, no governor, no president could be. A man who knew everyone by name and protected everyone he deemed worthy of protection. Among the flowers and wreaths, 1 bouquet without a card, white lilies, expensive, shipped from Los Angeles. Jeff Brown had ordered them at the request of a man who could not come in person. The touring schedule wouldn't allow it. But that man, upon hearing the news, canceled his evening show. For the first time in 3 years, he canceled a concert, sat down at a piano in an empty hotel room, and played for 3 hours, alone, in darkness, his eternal, familiar, inseparable darkness. Ray Charles never publicly told the story of the robbery and Bumpy. Never. Not in a single interview. Not in any autobiography. Not in any documentary. But the people close to him knew. Quincy Jones knew. Jeff Brown knew. And every time Ray came to New York after 1968, he asked to be driven to 133rd Street, to the barber shop. He would get out of the car, stand for 1 minute, listen to the sounds of the street, the buzz of clippers, the conversations, the laughter, then get back in. Not a word. Jeff asked him once, "Why do you do this every time?" Ray, "Because that building smells of cologne and old books. And that smell reminds me that there are people in the world who protect those who can't protect themselves. It's important for me to remember that, especially on the days when I forget." And Leroy Pullins? He kept his word. Every October, every single October without exception, he traveled from Baltimore to New York and worked as a volunteer at the Association for the Blind. 1962, 1963, 1964. Every year, even after Bumpy left this world in 1968, even when the man in the gray overcoat stopped sitting on the bench across the street. Pullins kept coming, not because he was afraid, there was no one left to fear, but because at some point the punishment had become something else, something that had no name in his vocabulary. He simply showed up every October, took a blind person by the hand, and walked them across the intersection, year after year, hand after hand, crosswalk after crosswalk, as if each crossing erased 1 second of those 5 seconds in the alley, the 5 seconds when he had stood behind a blind man and breathed and calculated and decided. 5 crosswalks, 5 seconds, the arithmetic of redemption, 1974. The barber shop on 133rd Street, no longer Johnny's but his nephew's, though the chairs were the same, and the smell was the same, and the hum of the clippers was the same. Junior, now past 60, gray-haired with bad knees that ached when it rained, sat in the center chair, the same chair where Bumpy had once sat with the ebony cane across his knees. Across from him, a young journalist from the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, writing a series of articles about the men who built Harlem. The journalist asked directly, "Everyone tells the Ray Charles story, the blindfold, the counting to 5, the cane tapping behind the chair, but nobody can explain why. Why did Bumpy do all that? He could have just beaten Pullins, could have just taken the money back. Why did he turn it into a ritual?" Junior was silent, picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, set it back down. "I'm going to tell you one thing, one time, and you will never print this in your newspaper." The journalist nodded. When Pullins left the barber shop, on trembling legs, face wet with tears, the door closed. There were 4 of us standing there. Bumpy sat in the chair. Nobody moved, but standing there. I thought he would say something about Pullins, something about Ray Charles, something about the money or respect or territory. Junior paused. The clippers hummed. He didn't say any of that. Another pause, longer. He was looking at his cane, the black ebony cane, lying across his knees, and I saw his face, not the face of a man who had just punished a thief, the face of a man who was thinking about something that started long before that evening and would end long after it, something bigger than one junkie and one blind musician, something that went all the way back to South Carolina, to the first time someone looked at a black child and saw nothing worth protecting. Junior set the coffee cup on the armrest. Then he said 7 words, quietly, almost to himself. The journalist waited. His pen was motionless above the notebook. 7 words that I remember every single day. That explain everything, not just Pullins, not just Ray Charles, but everything Bumpy ever did. Every punishment, every law, every person he protected, every person he removed. Silence. The clippers stopped. Even the nephew, who had been cutting hair and pretending not to listen, had turned off his machine. He said, "The one who hits the blind is blindest of all." The journalist did not write. The pen stayed frozen above the paper. Junior continued, slowly, like a man who had repeated these words to himself 1,000 times and understood them more deeply with each repetition. "You understand? Blind. It's not about eyes. Blind is every defenseless person, every person who gets hit because they can't hit back. A child, an old man, a beggar, a black person in white America, a man who can't see the sun but plays music that makes the whole world cry. And blindest of all, that's the person who looks at someone like that and sees only prey, who looks at weakness and sees opportunity. That's the truly blind one, and that's who Bumpy punished his entire life. Not thieves, not competitors. not enemies. He punished blindness, real blindness, blindness of the soul. Junior finished his coffee. That's why the blindfold. That's why the cane behind the chair. That's why the counting to 5. Bumpy wasn't taking revenge for Ray Charles. He was showing Pullens his own blindness. And you know what? It worked. Pullens still goes to the association every October, still guides blind people across intersections. Every October he opens his eyes, the same eyes that Bumpy could have taken but didn't, and leads a blind person by the hand, not because he's afraid, because he finally sees. The journalist closed his notebook. He kept his word. It was never printed. And the ebony cane, the same cane that Bumpy had been looking at when he spoke those 7 words, passed to Junior after Bumpy's passing. Junior kept it for 11 years in a glass case in his apartment on 147th Street until his own health failed and the cane passed into a private collection, where, according to those who have seen it, it remains to this day. On the inside of the silver handle, barely visible unless you know where to look, someone had carved 2 words in Latin, not engraved professionally, scratched in by hand with a penknife or a nail by a man who had learned Latin in prison and loved dead languages for their immortality. Custos infirmorum, protector of the weak. The same words that, according to people who knew him, Bumpy spoke in his last conversation. In that restaurant at that table, 1 minute before the glass of water tipped over on the white tablecloth. His friend couldn't remember the story Bumpy had been telling, but he remembered the last complete sentence before Bumpy paused, before his hand relaxed, before the water spread in a slow circle and the laughter stopped. You know what the point of everything I've done is? Not money, not power, not fear. The point is that someone who can't protect himself knows that somebody stands between him and the darkness, between him and the people who want to exploit his weakness. That's all. That's my entire code. 1 sentence. 1 sentence, 7 words on a cane. A lifetime of standing between the defenseless and the dark. This is the story of 3 people. A blind man who saw the world more clearly than those with sight. A gangster who protected the weak more fiercely than any law. And a thief who lost everything and found what he never knew he was looking for. October 1961. Harlem. 1 night, 1 blow, 1 pair of broken glasses on wet asphalt, and a legacy that outlived all 3 of them. The barber shop on 133rd Street is gone now. A mobile phone store occupies the space. Bright lights, glass counters, the synthetic chime of ringtones where clippers once hummed. The Hotel Teresa closed its doors as a hotel in 1966 and became an office building. The Apollo still stands, still hosts performers, still echoes with the ghosts of every genius who ever graced its stage. The alley behind the service exit has been repaved twice. No plaque marks the spot where Ray Charles knelt in the dark with bleeding fingers. But if you go to that corner on a Friday night, 133rd and 7th Avenue, and if you stand still, and if you listen past the taxi horns and the hip-hop from open windows and the conversations in Spanish and English and French and Wolof, you might hear something that everyone who knows the story of this place claims to hear. A sound that doesn't belong to the present. A sound from 1961. Tap, tap, tap. The cane. The ebony cane on tile. And a quiet voice, so quiet that you have to lean forward to hear it, which is itself a kind of submission, a kind of respect, saying 7 words that explain everything. The one who hits the blind is blindest of all. The darkness that Ray Charles lived in was not a curse. It was a mirror that forced the world to reveal its true nature. Some people looked at his blindness and saw weakness, an opportunity to steal. One man, a man everyone called a monster, looked at that same blindness and saw something completely different. He saw a reflection of the invisibility of every black person in America. And he decided that this invisibility had to be fought, not only with fists, though with fists too, not only with money, though with money too, but with a code, simple, ruthless, unbending. The weak are not to be touched. Artists are to be protected, and those who break this rule will be made to wish they had never opened their eyes. Custos infirmorum. Every October, somewhere in New York, an old man, much older now, slower, with hands that no longer tremble from withdrawal but from age, walks into the Association for the Blind, takes a stranger's hand, leads them across the street, doesn't say much, doesn't need to. His hands do the talking, the same hands that once stole from a blind man in a dark alley, now guiding a blind stranger through the light. And somewhere, in a private collection behind glass, an ebony cane rests on velvet. 2 words in Latin scratched into the silver handle. A bookmark, page 213, still tucked between the pages of a paperback copy of Invisible Man that sits beside it. And if you press your ear to the glass, the way Ray Charles once pressed a Breitling watch to his ear to hear its heartbeat, you might hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of a man who decided that no one would be invisible on his watch. The sound that Harlem remembers. The sound that Leroy Pullins hears every morning when he opens his eyes. The sunrise that Bumpy allowed. The darkness that Ray Charles transformed. And 7 words carved into black wood that outlived them all.